On this Friday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, we have some agent reports of players that have actually been in Memphis for workouts. We'll talk about some of those names. Plus, I'll give you some of my deep hidden gems, some diamonds in the rough for this NBA draft. And we'll close out with one more word on trade ideas and what the end result should be of any transaction. With that in mind,
let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Each and every time an episode drops, it is Locked On Grizzlies, and hopefully you are locked in with us. Thank you for humoring me on this Friday edition. My wonderful daughter Caroline being there in the beginning. Shout out to her, and shout out to you, dear listener, dear viewer, for making the correct choice and being with us for another episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Prize Picks. The easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. We are free and available wherever you get podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, literally anywhere you get a podcast, you can almost certainly find Locked On Grizzlies. And I, your host for this episode, Joe Mullinax, greatly appreciate it. I know my co-host, Michael Cole, who did a great job on yesterday's show, talking a little bit about the NBA Finals connection with Xavier Tillman, how he might be deployed by Boston, that sort of stuff. It was a great show, and the NBA Finals are in full swing. We're not going to talk NBA Finals today. We're going to focus on the NBA Draft. Very excited about the draft coming up, and I've done some film watching. I've done some studying. Not that I haven't already done so. I'm a Donovan Clingan expert. I can tell you that with absolute certainty. But I've also looked at some other more prominent prospects, some guys that are in the lottery mix. I've worked my way down my draft board, and I'm at a position now where I've got some guys that I love potentially in this draft. And we're going to discuss that here throughout the episode. Guys that I personally am excited about. We'll also talk a little bit about trades at the end of the show. I know that's been a topic both on social media and on the podcast this week. I'll put a little bow on that, at least for now, going into the weekend. What my ultimate vision for any trade would have to be. But first, the Grizzlies are fairly secretive when it comes to who comes in and does workouts for them over the span of a pre-draft process. Not every team is as secretive as the Grizzlies. Some of them are starting to be more and more similar to what Memphis likes to do in that realm. But the Grizzlies are one of the most secretive teams, or maybe uncommunicative, something like that. They don't talk about who's actually coming in and being a part of the process for them. And I do think that is not necessarily a bad thing. You like to have that flexibility. You like to have the possibility of researching a certain type. And I think one of the reasons, shout out to former host of Locked On Grizzlies, Sean Coleman, one of the things that makes Memphis so unique is that secrecy. And it's almost like you're trying to crack the code, which Sean Coleman a few years ago literally predicted an entire Grizzlies draft. There is a type that they have. We've learned that now going into 5 years of this front office with Joe Morant, with Taylor Jenkins as the coach, and of course, Zach Kleiman as the GM. We have a general understanding of what their type might be. But you do get reports from agents, right? Agents oftentimes are the ones that share the type of, or what player is going and conducting what workout as a means of advertising for their client. And we do have 3 names. Obviously, there's others as well, but there were 3 names that intrigued me the most in terms of these NBA draft workouts. And one of the most important things for me is obviously the Grizzlies not really showing their hand in terms of how they draft. But the fascinating piece of some of these guys is whether or not they're even in consideration for the draft itself. Some of these guys coming out of college that the Grizzlies are working out, it could be for the Memphis Hustle. It could be for two-way deals, contracts for training camp, whatever the case might be. It's not necessarily for that number 9 overall pick. And the 3 guys that I picked to talk about here are great examples of that. And my personal favorite, and I'm not even necessarily endorsing this as a guy that I would love to see Memphis bring into the fold. My personal favorite in terms of just irony is Jack Golke, of the Oakland Grizzlies. And I love the Grizzlies connection, obviously. But I also like Golke because he is the one that completely busted my bracket. If you remember correctly, the 14 seed Oakland Grizzlies are the ones that knocked off the 3 seed Kentucky Wildcats. Again, blowing up my bracket and a lot of other people's as well. They were eliminated by another team that blew up some brackets, NC State, and I'll talk a little bit more about NC State here in a moment. But Golke is one of the ones that's reported was in Memphis for a pre-draft workout. This is a guy who's a three-point specialist, 37.6% from beyond the arc. In his one season there in Oakland, he made the All-Horizon tournament team. He was in the 6th Man of the Year conversation for the Horizon League. Small school. He played at a Division II school, Hillsdale, for most of his career, and then he transferred to Oakland the final year of his college career, playing 36 games for them, 15 as a starter. So again, he was a 6th man type for Oakland. He shot 40% at the Division II Hillsdale. He shot 37% from 3. Truly a 3-point specialist, right? That's his main area of focus. He took 10 shots a game overall. 10 of them were threes. He did not drive to the basket. He is very much a marksman, a sharpshooter. There's not a ton else to his game as a rebounder, lots of other types of areas. So very specific skill set for Jack if he were in Memphis's crosshairs. Another interesting name, speaking of NC State, is a young man by the name of DJ Horne. A lot of folks love to talk about NC State, the fun that team was. The run that they went on obviously was extremely impressive. The run that they went on that was led by DJ Burns, right? The big man who got a lot of Zach Randolph comps all throughout the tournament. DJ Horne was his Mike Conley little buddy in terms of playing guard. And he did a lot of really impressive things himself in this process. This is another one, again, according to his agent, that had a workout with Memphis. He shot 40% from 3 as an ACC player for the 1 year at NC State, and I'll get to that here in a moment. He made the NCAA All-Region team. He was All-ACC this past season, All-ACC tournament. He was on the All-Freshman team for the Mountain Valley, I believe it is, because that's Illinois State is where DJ Horne started his career at Illinois State, and it's Missouri Valley, not Mountain Valley. So Missouri Valley Conference is where he began. Then he goes to Arizona State for a couple of years, finishes out at NC State. And he is a lead guard, 6'1", undersized, but he could check some point guard boxes. He was a heck of a scorer there at for the ACC champion, surprising champion, right? NC State, as they went on their tournament run. And then another interesting name for me, a big man, Hassan Ward. He started at VCU. One of the reasons I'm familiar with him is because he has a Richmond connection. I am in Richmond, Virginia, another VCU guy like Vince Williams Jr. So he starts at VCU for a few years, and then he's at Iowa State for a couple of seasons, and that's where he finished his career. Not really moving the needle aside from his defensive acumen, but he's another name that it is reported by his agent that he was in the mix for a Grizzlies workout. So what do all 3 of these guys have in common? They've moved around, right? All 3 of them were transfers, whether it was from Division II to Division I in the case of Jack, whether it was the case of DJ Horne moving up in classification, same thing with Hassan Ward moving up in classification. But these are guys that are quite literally not on a lot of draft boards, all right? These are guys that if Memphis is truly looking at them, it's not for necessarily a draft pick per se. It could be. Like DJ Horne, I could see potentially being a 2nd-round pick if Memphis wanted to go that route, secure another guard as a backup behind Scottie Pippen Jr. and Derrick Rose, that sort of thing. That actually would make some sense late in the 2nd round. But these are also names that you're looking at in terms of trying to build up your Memphis Hustle roster. These are guys that could potentially be unsigned, come in for training camp, summer league. You're looking for that kind of stuff in addition to the draft itself. So there's layers to this. The next thing that I noticed is a lot of these guys are self-made talents, right? Again, if you're starting at the level that you're starting at, whether it's Illinois State, whether it's VCU, a Division II school, Memphis is looking for guys that build themselves up. Joe Morant did that. Desmond Bane did that. Anybody that's been acquired by this front office, you got to remember Jaren Jackson Jr., obviously he was a big-time pick, but Jaren was not picked by this front office. They are looking for dudes that have built themselves. And I think that more than anything else, whether Horn or Golke or, whether Horn, Golke, or Ward wind up in Memphis, either on the hustle or on the Grizzlies themselves, like I said, Horn kind of feels like the most likely for that for me. Regardless, it is an interesting look into how the team is being built, how the roster is being prioritized. And again, one of the ways they have a type beyond the statistical data, they have a type in terms of wanting guys that have built themselves and have truly committed to getting the most juice out of the squeeze in terms of their talent. I think all three of those names that we just listed off, again, according to reports from agents, more so than the Grizzlies themselves, having workouts for the Grizzlies, they check those boxes to be sure. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, I have some hidden gems. I like the DJ Horn one in particular. That's interesting. But I've got three guys that I've picked out that I think check boxes both for the Grizzlies and for myself that we'll talk about next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Prize Picks. I'm a big fan of Prize Picks. With Prize Picks, you can turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a Prize Picks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you are locked in. I like that. The finals in particular mean more on Prize Picks, and so do the star players. You get boosted payouts on select basketball stars that you won't find anywhere else. For example, if you want Jaylen Brown for more than 25 points, Caitlin Clark for more than 3.5 three-pointers made. That's right. It's not just the NBA. It's the WNBA as well. Maybe Jason Tatum, more than 10 rebounds. You can combine all of those different types of selections with the good folks over at Prize Picks. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app today for Prize Picks and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It is that easy. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, my deep cuts, my diamonds in the rough, my hidden gems. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, flying solo on this episode. No DeMichael Cole. Very grateful to have you with me. We had a great chat earlier in the show talking about guys like a Jack Golke, like a Hassan Ward, like a DJ Horn. And as I mentioned, DJ Horn's the most intriguing to me. That might be one that maybe I bring up next week with DeMichael and see if he could see them taking another point guard and maybe trying to slot him in to one of those two-way contracts. Or again, they have done a good job, the Memphis Grizzlies have, of using the hustle, the G League affiliate there in South Haven. They've done a wonderful job getting them and developing guys and putting them through that process to get in the Grizzly system to potentially be better for the Grizzlies themselves. So all of those names can make sense in that way. But I personally believe, dear listener, dear viewer, that I have found three guys that also check those boxes. And if you're a fan of my work and been around what I have done in the past, you are very well aware that usually I include a Virginia Cavalier in this mix, and I've talked about Reese Beekman before. But this time, DeMichael would be so proud of me. I have not included a University of Virginia Cavalier. I've got three names that I like in the second round or undrafted that Memphis could sign. These are my hidden gems. Jonathan Mogbo is going to come up first. And Jonathan Mogbo has been mentioned here on this program. He also has been mentioned on social media, Grizzlies Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it now. Follow me on X at Joe Mullinax if you'd like. Mogbo has been mentioned as a first-round pick by some. I think Adam Pike is a good example of that. Adam Pike does a great job on Medium talking about the Memphis Grizzlies. Very talented writer, brilliant basketball mind, in my opinion. But I think he's really into Mogbo. And I like Mogbo because he's kind of like Kyle Anderson. And I was a Kyle Anderson guy. I wasn't as into him as the Kafka folks that were Kyle Anderson aficionados, so to speak. But I do like Mogbo as a second-round target. We've talked about him before. The only thing that makes me nervous about Mogbo, aside, his age, I don't necessarily care about. If anything, again, are we trying to win a championship or not? Mogbo's experience makes him more attractive to me. I'm worried about his three-point shooting, not necessarily because he has shown poor percentages, but because he didn't shoot threes at San Francisco. This is a guy who literally took 2 or 3 threes the entire season. According to Tankathon, he projects to a 31.6% NBA three-point percentage. They have to be basing that off of his free throw rate, which is about 69.2%. Not terrible. I'd like to see that be a little bit better. But this is a dude who literally across the board, his PER was phenomenal. And again, Brandon Clark is a guy who back in the day had a pretty impressive player efficiency rating. So all the advanced numbers love this guy. And again, we talk about the Grizzlies front office having a type. If they have a type, a lot of times it's driven by the numbers, and Mogbo is a good example of that. I worry about his three-point shooting and the fact that he's just not been willing to do so. But he checks literally every other box. And in the second round, you certainly can do a heck of a lot worse. I'm not saying I would take Mogbo 9 overall by any stretch. Maybe if they traded into the late first, if you really like a guy. Because again, you got to remember, this is a front office that's taken Santi Aldama, that has taken guys like Desmond Bane that other teams had passed on. I would like to see him shoot some more threes, but he definitely checks a lot of Kyle Anderson boxes. He's good at everything except shooting the basketball from beyond the arc, basically. So Mogbo's one that I like in the second round. Somebody that all he basically does is shoot threes in a lot of ways is Baylor Shireman of Creighton. Now, he gives off Doug McDermott vibes for me. He's a senior, again, kind of fills my void of wanting it to be an experienced player. He's going to be 24 years old next season. And again, are you talking about high ceilings or are you talking about high floors? For me, Shireman has a really high floor as a true shooter. If you want to get a guy like a Donovan Clingan in the first round, a big that isn't necessarily a floor spacer, this is a poor man's Dalton Connect for me, at least in terms of three-point shooting. He's got a great frame at 6'7.5", not quite the wingspan you would want, about 6'8", but it's not a negative wingspan. And he does a phenomenal job rebounding for his size. He was one of the better rebounders in the Big East there at Creighton, considering all that he's had to deal with in terms of his physical limitations. Really an impressive resume that he built. He projects to be roughly a 40% NBA three-point shooter within the right scheme. That's key, right? Like if he is able to physically do the things necessary. He had impressive times at the NBA Combine in the shuttle and three-quarter sprint. I don't think he is a bad athlete, but I do think he is somebody that in terms of his three-point shooting, especially if you're going to be moving on from Luke Kennard at some point, this could be a guy that you could look into as an option for that process if you don't want to do it in the first round. And then my third choice, so I have Shireman, I have Mogbo. Peyton Sanford is another guy very similar, to be honest with you, to Baylor Shireman. This guy comes from Iowa. And to be honest with you, he is a worse defender, more than likely, than a guy like our boy Shireman. I like Shireman better as a two-way player than I do Sanford. His numbers were not as impressive. A really bad max vertical, not the leaper in terms of 28 inches. It's not like Shireman was much better at 32, but the athleticism is a larger question with Sanford. The three-point shooting, again, not a question. 91% free throw shooter, shot 38% at Iowa, took a lot of advantage of the attention that was paid to other Iowa Hawkeyes, right? Pretty impressive what Iowa was able to do over the span of the career of, Caitlin Clark, obviously on the girls' side, the women's side. Sanford is somebody who gives you that shooting and spacing that could be available in the second round. And again, if you keep Kennard for this coming season, you don't want to re-sign him, maybe Sanford or Shireman. Again, I think I'd go Shireman before Sanford. Those guys play for the Memphis Hustle, get adjusted to professional speed, play some games up with the Grizzlies, right? If they're a two-way contract, and then they're ready to go for their next year. There's ways to use that. So Mogbo is probably the best option. But again, he's a non-shooting option. He's not necessarily a shooting threat. The other two guys that I went with are Shireman and Sanford. I like both of those guys. Around 39, wherever Memphis winds up picking in the second round, maybe it's somebody that they trade up for. Obviously, the Grizzlies currently slated to pick number 39 overall. Shireman goes before, according to Tankathon and their mock draft, at 38 to the Knicks, and then Sanford goes at 40. Oso Ighodaro is the pick for Marquette for the Grizzlies, a 6'11 big. Again, could do worse than that, of course, and he's a good creator of offense offensively. So There in the second round, it's really about type, what you're kind of looking to do. I like the shooting of Shireman and Sanford. Those would be my picks if they don't go Mogbo. Because, again, Mogbo's a really talented player. He just doesn't shoot the basketball. You'd almost have to keep Luke Kennard in that particular case. Do you have any hidden gems, any diamonds in the rough? Do you agree with me on Shireman, Mogbo? Again, I talked about DJ Horn, who the Grizzlies have actually worked out according to agent reports. How do you feel about these names? Let me know in the comments below. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we'll close out the show for the week talking about my personal goals from any trade. Spoiler alert, if you've been checking out the show, you probably know where I'm going with this, but I won't kill the lead this time like I did earlier in the week. I do want to remind you that this episode, I feel like I've had my analytical hat on, right? I broke it down 6 prospects for you, dear listener, dear viewer. And aside from being excited, as I tend to get, I haven't screamed at you, right? I'm not angry with you. This isn't Fox Sports. This isn't ESPN. We're not starting any, fires that we have to put out days later. This is Locked On Grizzlies, a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and each and every day. And we now have the first of its kind 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube called Locked On Sports Today. Make sure you're checking it out, not just for Locked On Grizzlies, but Locked On Celtics, Locked On Mavericks, as the NBA Finals, the NHL with the Stanley Cup, Locked On Florida Panthers, right? Whatever the case might be, there are options for you in terms of what type of content you're looking for from sports with the great analysis that Locked On provides. Check it out over on Locked On Sports Today. Also, check it out on YouTube as well as the Amazon Fire TV free channels app. Again, when we come back, closing out the show, what any endeavor of a trade should be sure to accomplish. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I'm Joe Mullinax. Once again, flying solo, no DeMichael Cole. He'll be back with me on the Monday episode of Locked On Grizzlies. We'll check in on the NBA Finals, see how things went, both on over the weekend, see how everything was playing out, the health of Kristaps Porzingis, how Xavier Tillman was utilized, that sort of stuff. Any news that maybe comes out over the weekend about the Lakers coaching search. Dan Hurley, it was announced, is the leading candidate for the Lakers. Maybe we talk about that college to pro jump and how that could impact the lay of the land in the Western Conference. DeMichael will be back with us for that Monday edition of the show. But I want to close out this episode of Locked On Grizzlies looking at, we talked a lot about trades this week, right? Trading for a wing potentially, or trading for a center, a big, a Jared Allen, right? I think the consensus was kind of Jared Allen or Brook Lopez made more sense than my wing trading idea. But Adeni Avdija, Kyle Kuzma from the Wizards. There has not necessarily been blowback because I think people just kind of expect me to talk about trades at this point, given my decade plus covering the Memphis Grizzlies and my fascination with trades. But there's also been a point made by DeMichael here on the show and others on social media, like Ryan G. I want to shout him out on X, talking about he's always very anti-trade. He's kind of the yin to my yang in terms of trades. I love trades and he does not. And he reminded me and us that follow him on social media, we have yet to see this team at full strength, because even the 9 games that John Morant played, even that wonderful snippet of a season that was 6-3 and it was a chance for us to pretend that the Grizzlies were contenders again, those 9 games did not have Steven Adams. Now, obviously, Steven Adams is not walking through that door, period, right? He was traded to the Houston Rockets. But however the Memphis Grizzlies decide to address the center position, right? However they bring in another big, whether it's the draft, free agency, trade, whatever, we have not seen a large sample size of Luke Kennard and Gigi Jackson and Vince Williams Jr. and Marcus Smart alongside Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Jaren Jackson Jr. Oh, and by the way, Brandon Clark, who is also dealing with a long-term injury that impacted that run of success. And we've talked about how Clark could be like a Dallas Mavericks big alongside Ja Morant to their Kyrie Irving, and having that vertical lob threat that could help open up this Grizzlies offense, whether it's 5 out, 4 out, whatever the case might be. So I do think there is something to the idea of any trade, and this is from Matt Hardlicka's Patreon page, and I agree with him completely. If you are going to make a trade that disrupts the top 9 players on this team, right? And I think most of us would agree the top 9 players, Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Marcus Smart, Brandon Clark, Jaren Jackson Jr., Gigi Jackson, Vince Williams Jr., Santi Aldama is probably in that mix. If those are your top 8 or 9 guys, whatever trade you're making, if it involves them, has to bring in somebody better. It has to. It has to be somebody better. Maybe not necessarily than John Morant. But if you are trading 9 and Marcus Smart, that guy that you're getting in return needs to be demonstrably better than Marcus Smart. Significantly better. Again, it doesn't need to be DeMar DeRozan in a sign and trade or Mikal Bridges. That's not realistic more than likely. But it needs to be an upgrade. It needs to be something that is clearly going to help Ja, Dez, and Jaren thrive this season. If it's not worth doing. Because you and I, we truly don't know what the heck this team is. We know that they're going to address the big situation. That's fantastic. They need to. But you don't have to draft Donovan Clingan. Would I like them to? Yeah. A dominant big that helped lead a back-to-back national champion dominant run that might lead to Dan Hurley getting one of the most amazingly fruitful for a coach contracts in the history of the NBA. Is Hurley that much of a genius? Maybe, but I also think Donovan Clingan is pretty darn good at basketball. And he checks a lot of Grizzlies boxes in terms of need, in addition to his offensive acumen. He is a lot like Steven Adams in terms of what he can provide for this Grizzlies team, not just defensively and drop coverage, but also offensively as a passer at and around the elbow. He showed it at UConn at the highest levels of college basketball on both ends of the floor. Would I like for him to be a floor spacer? Sure. But he's a cost-controlled asset that can be exactly what this team needs at a glaring position of need. But you can get there other ways. And I'm still of the opinion that this is a team that can address that problem in a variety of ways. I might have a way that I would do it, and I'm opinionated about it. I like Donovan Clingan. I think he makes sense. But as I've said before, it can be handled in free agency. There are bigs that you can acquire for the vet minimum or the mid-level exception or whatever the Grizzlies version of the mid-level exception will look like. That can be addressed there. That's true. There are other pathways that don't have to go through the draft. What makes me not necessarily nervous, because I know the Grizzlies are going to do a trade. Like, it's cool to be anti-trade, but the history of this front office suggests a trade is coming, right? Whatever that trade looks like, it needs to be, if it involves one of those top guys, it needs to be a trade for one of those top guys. Now, if they trade up to go get Clingan and all it involves is draft capital, that's different, right? If it's a trade to trade back, we heard numerous reports, Zach Lowe on the Lowe Post, guys talking about the Grizzlies really liking this draft because there's a lot of role player types. And it makes sense that Memphis would like this draft because they've got their stars. They believe John Morant is their superstar. They're Luka Doncic. They're Jason Tatum. They believe a combination of Desmond Bane and Jaren Jackson Jr. is their Kyrie Irving, is their Jaylen Brown. There's just 3 that make up the value of 2. The Grizzlies clearly believe that to be the case. So if this draft is full of role players, like a Mogbo, if he winds up being Kyle Anderson was an extremely effective player both for Memphis and for Minnesota this past season. If there are numerous role player types in this draft, the Grizzlies should like this draft. The question becomes, what are you willing to give up, like we talked about in terms of moving up? Or if you move back, you are kind of resigning yourself to the fact if Clingan falls, he most certainly wouldn't be there if you trade back too far. And you're saying Khalil Ware, or you're saying Zach Edey is your guy. And again, as long as that particular position is addressed, I'm cool with it. But if you're going to have a trade for a Marcus Smart, Luke Kennard, whatever the case might be, plus number 9, what's coming back needs to be clearly a better fit. Because if it's not, you are disrupting something that we don't even necessarily know what it fully looks like yet. And that would be concerning for me. That does concern me. So I am more of the mind to trade draft capital, whether you trade up, trade back, whatever the case might be. If you want numerous picks in this draft, I could be talked into that. If you want less picks in this draft and you just want to make sure you get your guy, I could be talked into that too. If there is a trade that involves actual players, as fun as it sounds, like Denny Avdija would make Memphis better if it's Luke Kennard and number 9 for Danny Avdija. That would make Memphis better. You could argue it would make Memphis better if it's Kyle Kuzma, Kennard and Zaire and number 9. That probably gets you Kuzma, maybe with a second rounder. And that makes Memphis noticeably better. There's no denying that, in my opinion. Because Kuzma becomes your fourth best player. And as DeMichael and I talked about earlier in the week, who knows what Kuzma does on the fourth as a fourth best player on a team, similar to the model that Boston is showing us in the NBA Finals as we speak. Make sure it's an upgrade to the championship possibilities now. No steps back, player related. Draft capital, I could be talked into either way. Thank you so much for being with me on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Hopefully you enjoyed it. A little bit of a deeper dive in some of the diamonds in the rough, so to speak, of this NBA draft, both in terms of guys that have reportedly worked out for the Grizzlies, as well as guys that should work out for the Grizzlies if they haven't already done so, because I'm a fan of their games. And, of course, that finishing up conversation about the value of trades here. Make sure you're checking out Locked On Sports Today if you haven't already done so. 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Check it out on Amazon Fire as well, on the TV channels app. Make sure that you are liking, commenting, rating, reviewing, subscribing, all of those fun things when it comes to Locked On Grizzlies. Make us a part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption each and every time that an episode drops. The next time we're together will be on Monday. DeMichael and I will check in on the NBA Finals. We'll see if there's any other Grizzlies workout rumors that we've gotten and check in on the Lakers and Dan Hurley rumors as well. Thank you 1,000 times for being with us. I'm Joe Mullinax. Stay locked in, Grizzlies fans. Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get it, plus on YouTube. Make sure you stay locked in. We'll catch you next time.